the general theme that we were discussing was financial structuring, with two questions, which were essentially one, what was the group's experience with, or what barriers could we identify related directly or indirectly, because I think the conversation got was pretty broad at some times, related to financial structuring that we've encountered in particular city, country, or institutional context. And then secondly, what are some of the experiences that we've had on the solutions side of addressing those barriers related to financial structuring? So just to run through some of these, the first, and I think by the end we had 18 or 19 points. This is supposed to be a kind of grouping of the major themes that came across through those points. So the first and most, I think, recurrent theme was about technical capacity, tools, and data. And we were quite mindful that the other groups would also comment on this, but I think folks participating in the breakout group did feel that these had direct implications for financial conversations around financial structuring, because if you're trying to identify and discuss what's an appropriate structure or financing vehicle for a particular project or activity, you really do need good information on what is the incremental cost, what's the additional cost of building this asset to where it's resilient to future climate scenarios. Also, on the tools and data side, so modeling capacity to make the upfront economic case of justifying some incremental cost or additional cost for building in climate resilience to the project, but we generally lack the modeling tools necessary to make the math work out, and which would otherwise show these are the cost that will accrue in the future if we don't make this particular asset resilient to future climate scenarios, and be able to price in those externalities. Another interesting point related to that was that even where models do exist, and even where we can make a good business case for it, those models only really are built to capture and monetize the commercial benefits, but we could probably even show the math and justify a broader set of actions if we had tools that would allow us to more robustly monetize the non-commercial or even non-economic / financial benefits of a particular project, whether it's economic environmental co-benefits or social co-benefits. A second point that was made, which I thought was quite useful, is just to remind ourselves that we also need to be ensuring that we're building the capacity in the private sector to price in these externalities, because even if we have the best tools available at the World Bank or the GEF or even in National Development Bank context, that only covers a certain subset of projects where there is a direct public financial institution directly involved, and the private sector leads development of a lot of infrastructure projects and just their own projects as well, where we want to make sure that the tools can also be adapted and used by the private sector. The third was, and it I think also relates to the first point, financial structures for non-revenue generating projects. So we certainly know that private sector interest is going to be higher in certain sectors and certain types of projects in certain country contexts. And that highlighting that we really need to have a discussion around which types of financing vehicles and structures, coupled with perhaps some of these more robust economic cost-benefit analysis analytical tools that would enable us to capture the non-economic benefits, which may be able to justify some of these projects. A fourth point, which we unfortunately did not get to discuss in great detail, but it came up in a number of ways, was about prioritization of limited public and concessional finance. So recognizing that the depth of private capital markets is different across developing countries, access to, or the growth maturity of the insurance sector varies greatly across developing country contexts. So it's difficult to divorce conversations around appropriate and viable financial structures from a particular country's context or a sectoral context. And maybe through those conversations it would help lead to, or it help kind of show the way on what types of sectors or countries or activities should public or concessional finance be prioritized for. Another, which I thought was a quite good point that was raised, was the difference in time frames and time scales of all the different actors that are involved in financing infrastructure projects. So I think the example that was used in the breakout group was, say it's a public-private partnership in a developing country to build a road. You may have one actor that's involved in developing the technical design and is in charge of the construction phase. So that actor's time frame might be 2 or 3 years. That actor's saying, I'm going to have this asset on my books for 2 to 3 years, so I'm concerned about what may or may not happen to this asset over that time frame. And then that asset may be transferred to a longer-term holder, like the municipality or the national government, who is going to hold that asset for the entire usable lifetime of the asset, so 30 or 40 years. And then there, they may be more interested in the different future climate scenarios, and their economic analysis may be a little different than the first asset holder. And then that relates to financial structures, and that we need to keep in mind that financial structures need to be, that the appropriate financial structure may change depending on the different time frame and who's holding the asset, and what their interests are and time scales are. Another point that was raised, which I think came up before as well, was difficulty in coming up with viable financial structures for small-scale projects, which are often not attractive to larger private infrastructure funds or even multilateral development banks in some cases. Another challenge that was highlighted was MDB requirements for sovereign guarantees, where they're co-financing projects in host countries. We also, the issue of definitional challenges also came up in our realm of resilience versus adaptation. What do they mean to the different actors, and what are the implications on what they may be interested in financing because of that? Another issue, which I think also came up in other realms, is the challenges that uncertainty on access to external sources of finance plays in making some of these decisions on financial structuring. So certainly, if you don't know, if you can't necessarily count on a private actor or even receiving money from a public fund for a particular infrastructure deal, it makes it a difficult conversation to come up with a precise financial structure that will work for that asset. And the last point, I think, also related to I think in part philosophical conversation, but one with real implications. And it was around, I think it was kicked off by an intervention from someone who said, well, it sounds like a lot of the things that we've been talking about really relate to just general private challenges around financial structuring for private investment in infrastructure. But we're talking about adaptation, and as we know, and as we heard in some of the presentations earlier, the private sector isn't terribly interested in financing our adaptation costs. And I think this relates to a slide that was included in one presentation from UNCTAD, where it was supposed to show current level of private sector interest and engagement in different sectors, and what's the potential for private sector interest in a given sector. And it had every sector that makes up a country's economy and every sector that makes up the global economy listed there. And it showed, to varying degrees, but on balance, that there's a lot more potential for private sector engagement and interest across all of these different sectors. And then it had listed as a separate sector climate adaptation. And then it had very low levels of private sector interest. And I think it gets to the heart of sometimes when the climate and the infrastructure finance communities are talking past one another, because hopefully what we're talking about, which I think was an overarching theme of a lot of the presentations, was that we're talking about mainstreaming climate considerations into, we're trying to make our economies resilient to future climate scenarios. So if the private sector is interested in every sector that makes up the economy, and we're talking about making our economies resilient to climate change, why should the private sector not be interested in that? And so then there was another intervention, I think, where it was looking at that more in that way from the mainstreaming angle, and was highlighting that really we're trying to have a conversation on financial structuring of climate resilient infrastructure, but indeed it's the case that it's not necessarily a novel conversation, and that a lot of these barriers do just relate to financial structuring around infrastructure writ large, regardless of whether you're trying to build climate resilient infrastructure or not climate resilient infrastructure. And that it is, in fact, if you would just hive off the climate adaptation part and try to force yourself to demonstrate a business case just around the adaptation component of a larger infrastructure project, that is kind of an uphill battle, but that's not necessarily the challenge that we have. Really building in climate resilience considerations should just be part of good project design and engineering, and then the financing discussion isn't necessarily a novel conversation to have. It's just about financing that asset in general. We unfortunately also had a conversation that was balanced more around the challenges and barriers. But in a couple of areas, folks shared some of their experiences with potential solutions and ways to address these barriers. So when we were discussing the issue with small-scale projects and MDBs not being at a large enough size to where MDBs would be interested in larger-scale infrastructure funds, there were a couple examples that were given in the area of asset pooling or project aggregation facilities. Of course, we noted that these, to date, their use has been limited, but I think it was an example related to the BRICS New Development Bank, and it was an aggregation, I think it was in Russia, an aggregation of smaller scale hydropower projects into a larger single kind of financing structure, which made it of interest to something like the NDB, which isn't trying to get involved in projects in the thousands or hundreds of thousands. The second solution that I think we discussed related to the topic of insurance. So one of the issues with insurance is, especially given the lifetime of some of these assets is 30 and 40 years, in order for insurance to work in that context, and in order for it to be affordable, you need all of the relevant actors to hold insurance and carry insurance policies throughout the usable lifetime of the asset. Which doesn't always happen. Here it was an example from, I guess, a recent development in Morocco, which where they promulgated some new requirements for businesses and maybe even individuals or homeowners to insure certain types of assets. And then also some ongoing work on developing a sustainable roadmap for the insurance sector here in Morocco and perhaps regionally. But I think we'll have some representatives from the insurance industry here tomorrow who might be able to clarify anything